The UES Colossus was the pride of the whole human fleet. It was the biggest warship humanity had ever built. It was 3 kilometers long, covered in thick armor plates, and armed with more guns than any other ship in the sky. When people talked about the Colossus, they did not just call it a ship. They called it the Wall. They said nothing could get past it. They said as long as the wall was standing, humanity was safe. Admiral Marcus Cade had commanded the Colossus for 6 years. He was a calm man, not loud, not proud, but very sure of himself. His crew trusted him completely. When he gave an order, nobody asked why, they just did it, because Cade had never once been wrong about a battle. That was why nobody worried when the fleet moved into the Halden Reach. The Halden Reach was a quiet stretch of space between 3 star systems. It was not important for resources. It was not important for trade. It was important because it sat right on the edge of Ashan Dominion territory, the empire humanity had been fighting for almost 9 years. The Ashan were not like humans. They did not look like humans, and they did not think like humans either. They were tall, thin, covered in pale gray skin that looked almost like stone, and they moved in ways that seemed slow and careful, like they were always thinking about their next step before they took it. Human scientists who studied Ashan battles noticed something strange about them very early in the war. The Ashan almost never did anything unexpected. Every fleet movement, every formation, every attack seemed to follow some kind of plan that never changed. Human commanders called this Ashan doctrine, but they did not understand yet how deep that doctrine really went. The Ashan called it the first pattern. It was not just a battle plan to them, it was closer to a religion. Every young Ashan soldier learned the first pattern before they learned almost anything else. It told them how to attack, how to defend, how to retreat, and even how to speak to an enemy before a battle began. Breaking the pattern was not just a mistake to the Ashan. It was shameful. It was almost like breaking a promise to their ancestors. An Ashan soldier who deviated from the pattern without permission from a pattern keeper could be removed from their post, or worse, cast out of their unit entirely, treated as if they no longer existed. Humanity did not know any of this yet. All humanity knew was that the Ashan fought in strict, predictable ways, and so far, brute strength and firepower had been enough to hold them back. The Colossus was built for exactly that kind of fight. Big guns, thick armor, overwhelming force. 9 years of war had taught humanity a few simple lessons about the Ashan. Their ships were well made, their soldiers were disciplined, and their commanders almost never panicked. But humanity had also learned that Ashan fleets rarely tried anything creative. If a human fleet held a strong defensive position, the Ashan usually waited, gathered more ships, and attacked only when their numbers were clearly superior. If a human fleet retreated in a certain way, the Ashan often let them go rather than chase, as if chasing broke some rule nobody on the human side understood. War analysts had written long reports about Ashan caution, assuming it was simply a careful, slow-moving culture. Nobody in human command had guessed that this caution was not caution at all. It was obedience. The Ashan were not being careful. They were following instructions that had been written long before any of them were born, instructions so deeply respected that no soldier would think to question them, even when questioning them might have won a battle faster. At 0400 hours, ship time, the human fleet entered the Halden Reach in a wide defensive formation, with the Colossus at the center. Sensors picked up a small Ashan patrol on the far edge of the system, only 6 ships. Cade ordered the fleet to hold position and watch. It looked like a normal patrol. It looked like nothing worth worrying about. That was the trap. The 6 Ashan ships were not a patrol, they were bait. The moment the human fleet settled into position to observe them, more than 80 Ashan warships dropped out of hidden positions behind 3 nearby asteroid fields. The Ashan called this maneuver the closing fist, a formation described in the oldest parts of the first pattern, used only when the enemy could be lured into standing still long enough to be surrounded. Alarms went off across the human fleet. Cade's voice stayed calm as he gave orders, but the numbers were bad. The Colossus alone could fight off a dozen ships without much trouble. 80 ships, arriving all at once from multiple directions, was a different problem entirely. On the bridge of the Colossus, officers scrambled to reorganize the fleet's formation. Smaller human ships pulled back toward the Colossus, hoping to use its armor as cover, while they added their own firepower to the fight. For the first several minutes, the plan seemed to work. The Colossus took hit after hit without losing a single major system. Its return fire tore through the closest Ashan ships almost as fast as they arrived. Cade watched the display calmly, giving small, precise orders, moving ships here and there like pieces on a board he had studied 1,000 times before. To the younger officers around him, it looked, for a little while, like just another hard battle that the wall would win, the same way it always had. The battle that followed lasted less than 40 minutes, but it felt much longer to the people who survived it. The Colossus fired everything it had. It destroyed 11 Ashan ships in the first 10 minutes alone. Its armor held against attack after attack, long after smaller human ships had already been destroyed or forced to retreat. For a while, it looked like the wall might hold, just like it always had. Then the Ashan changed their attack pattern. It was not something the human fleet had seen before. Instead of continuing to fire from all directions, the Ashan ships split into smaller groups and began striking the exact same section of the Colossus's hull, over and over, in a rotating order. Human engineers later studied the recordings and realized the Ashan were following a very old and very rare part of the first pattern, one meant only for destroying a single, extremely powerful enemy ship. It was designed to wear down one point of armor until it broke, no matter how long that took, or how many ships were lost doing it. The rotating strikes came in a strict order, always the same 6 ships taking turns, always striking within centimeters of the last hit, as if following a diagram nobody on the human side could see. Cade ordered evasive maneuvers, hoping to break up the pattern by changing the Colossus's angle, but even that had apparently been accounted for. Every time the ship turned, the attacking Ashan ships adjusted just enough to keep striking the same weakening section. It was not fast thinking. It was memorized thinking, executed so smoothly that it looked almost like a dance rehearsed for centuries. It took nearly 25 minutes, but the armor broke. The Colossus lost power to half its systems in seconds. Its return fire slowed. More Ashan ships closed in, following the same order, striking the same weakening point. When the final blow came, the explosion was visible from 3 systems away. The strongest ship humanity had ever built was gone, along with more than 4,000 crew members, including Admiral Marcus Cade. The rest of the human fleet retreated. There was nothing else they could do. News of the Colossus reached Earth within 2 days. It was the worst single loss humanity had suffered since the war began. People who had never worried about the war before suddenly worried. If the wall could fall, what could stop the Ashan from reaching Earth itself? Fleet Admiral Yara Ose, the woman in charge of the entire human war effort, sat alone in her office for nearly an hour after she received the full report. She had known Cade for 20 years. She had recommended him for his post. She had told the government, more than once, that as long as the Colossus existed, Earth was safe. Now, she had to explain why that was no longer true. The government wanted a new flagship. They wanted something even bigger than the Colossus, something that could not be broken the same way. Ose understood why they wanted that. She wanted it too, in a way. But she also understood something the government did not want to hear. The Ashan had studied the Colossus for years before they found a way to destroy it. If humanity built something even bigger, the Ashan would eventually study that too, and find a way to destroy it as well. Bigger and stronger was not a strategy. It was just buying time. The arguments in government meetings went on for days. Some officials wanted 3 new flagships instead of 1, believing that more ships of the same kind would guarantee safety through sheer numbers. Others wanted to slow down construction and study the Colossus's destruction more carefully before building anything at all, afraid of spending years and enormous resources on a ship that could be destroyed the same way. A few quiet voices, mostly engineers and analysts rather than politicians, pointed out that the Ashan had needed years of observation before they found a way to bring down the Colossus. If humanity built something similar, only larger, the Ashan would eventually study it too, patiently, the way they seemed to study everything, and eventually find its weak point as well. Ose listened to all of it without saying much. She had spent her whole career building and defending large, powerful ships. It was strange to her, sitting in those meetings, to realize she was no longer sure that bigger ships were the answer at all. While the government argued about what to build next, Ose quietly asked to see a project that had been sitting mostly forgotten in a research shipyard near Mars. It was called the UES Mockingbird. The Mockingbird was, on paper, a disappointment. It was a mid-sized ship, far smaller than the Colossus, with weapons that were considered weak compared to most modern warships. Several senior officers had already recommended the project be shut down, and its funding moved elsewhere. The ship's chief designer, an engineer named Dr. Priya Nair, had built the Mockingbird around a completely different idea. Instead of armor and firepower, the ship was packed with advanced sensors, signal projectors, decoy systems, and communication tools powerful enough to intercept and imitate almost any known transmission format. Nair had once described her design in a report that most senior officers had ignored. We cannot outbuild the Ashan forever. At some point, we have to outthink them instead. Osei read that report twice. She also asked for the file of Captain Elena Reyes, an officer who had spent 3 years in fleet intelligence before being quietly moved out of the position after a disagreement with a superior officer. Reyes had argued, loudly and more than once, that human commanders were relying too much on raw power and not paying enough attention to how strangely rigid Ashan battle patterns actually were. Her superior had called her theories interesting but not useful. She had been reassigned to a minor training post soon after, a career move that most people in the fleet understood as a quiet punishment. Osei called Reyes into her office 2 weeks after the Colossus was destroyed. Reyes was in her late 30s, with short dark hair and a serious, careful way of speaking. She had not expected to be called to fleet command. She had assumed her career in any meaningful position was over. Osei did not waste time with small talk. She placed a data slate on the table between them, showing full battle records of the Ashan attack on the Colossus, along with several years of older Ashan engagement data that Reyes had reviewed many times before, back when nobody wanted to listen to her conclusions. "You said the Ashan never improvise," Osei said. "You said their entire war strategy depends on following rules nobody is allowed to break. Do you still believe that?" Reyes studied the new data carefully before answering. The attack pattern used against the Colossus was strange, old, and extremely specific. It was not a new idea. It was something ancient, something pulled out and used only because the situation called for it exactly. That, more than anything, confirmed what she had believed for years. "Yes," Reyes said, "more than ever." "Then explain something to me," Osei said. "If they follow rules that strictly, what happens when the rules stop making sense?" Reyes did not have a full answer yet, but she had a theory, one she had been building quietly for years, even after she was moved away from intelligence work. The Ashan feared breaking the pattern more than they feared death. Every officer, every soldier, every ship captain had been raised to believe that following the pattern correctly was the only path to honor, and deviating from it without permission was close to the worst thing an Ashan could do. If that was true, then the Ashan military machine, as powerful as it was, had a weakness built directly into its foundation. It did not know how to handle situations the pattern had never described. It did not know how to face confusion. Nobody had ever really tested that weakness before, because nobody had the tools to create that kind of confusion on a large scale. Osei told Reyes about the Mockingbird. At first, Reyes assumed it was a joke, or some kind of test. The ship Osei described sounded almost useless by fleet standards, a ship built to trick and confuse rather than to fight directly. But as Osei explained Dr. Nair's design in more detail, Reyes began to understand what the ship was actually for. It was not built to replace the Colossus in a straight fight. It was built to make straight fights unnecessary. "Command wants a bigger ship," Osei said. "The government wants a bigger ship. Everyone wants something they can point to and say, 'This will keep us safe.' I am not sure that ship exists anymore, but I think this one might do something else. I think it might make it so the Ashan forget how to fight us at all." Reyes did not answer right away. It sounded almost impossible. An entire alien military doctrine, built over what was probably centuries, could not simply stop working because of one small ship. But she thought about the recordings again. She thought about 80 Ashan ships, arriving at exactly the right moment, using exactly the right maneuver, taken directly from an old and rarely used part of a rulebook none of them were allowed to question. She thought about what would happen if that rulebook suddenly stopped giving clear answers. "Give me the ship," Reyes said, "and give me time to test something first, somewhere small. If I am wrong, we will know quickly, and nobody important will be hurt finding out." Osei studied her for a long moment. Most of the fleet's senior staff had already written the Mockingbird off as a failed experiment. Most of them had already written Reyes off as well, an officer with strange ideas and a habit of arguing with people above her rank. Giving her command of the ship was, in the eyes of many, a way of quietly sending a problem officer to a quiet, unimportant post, exactly the kind of move Reyes had already experienced once before. But Osei had read enough reports on the Colossus, and enough of Reyes's old theories, to want to know the answer to one question. What happened to an enemy that had never once been forced to think for itself? You have the ship, Osei said. You have a small crew, and you have one assignment first. There is a supply outpost near the edge of the Halden Reach, close to where we lost the Colossus. An Ashan patrol has been seen nearby. Nothing large, nothing that should worry anyone. Fleet Command considers this mission low priority. That is exactly why I am sending you. Reyes understood what that meant. If she succeeded, almost nobody would notice. If she failed, almost nobody would care. It was, in every practical sense, an assignment designed to fail quietly, and Osei was giving it to her anyway, because there was nothing left to lose by trying. 3 days later, Reyes stood on the bridge of the UES Mockingbird for the first time. The ship was smaller than she had expected, its interior filled with sensor arrays and communication equipment, instead of the heavy weapon systems she was used to seeing on other warships. Rows of consoles she had never seen on a normal warship lined the walls of the bridge, each one connected to systems built for listening, copying, and projecting signals rather than firing weapons. Her crew, assembled quickly over the past 3 days, waited quietly for her first orders. None of them were strangers to disappointment. Lieutenant Tomas Vale, her tactical officer, had been passed over for promotion twice, after a mission report questioned a superior's decision. Chief Engineer Sana Okoro had spent the last 2 years fixing other people's broken ships, instead of building anything of her own, after a reactor project she designed was cancelled for being too unusual for fleet standards. Communications Officer Devin Ashworth had transferred from 3 different postings in 2 years, always labeled a good officer with bad luck. None of them had asked for the Mockingbird. All of them had been sent there because somebody higher up needed to put them somewhere quiet. Reyes gathered them in the small briefing room behind the bridge and told them exactly what she believed, without softening it. She told them the ship they were standing on could not win a straight fight against a real Ashan warship, and that anyone expecting it to would be disappointed. She told them the Ashan followed an ancient set of battle rules so strictly that soldiers who broke those rules without permission were treated as if they had betrayed their own people, and she told them that their mission was not to destroy Ashan ships one at a time, the way every other human vessel in the fleet was built to do. Their mission was to make the Ashan doubt the rules they had trusted their entire lives. Okoro asked the obvious question: if the ship could not fight, what happened when a fight found them anyway? Reyes did not pretend to have a perfect answer. She said the ship's decoys and signal systems were built to make an enemy believe they were facing something very different from what was actually there, long enough to buy time, confuse a response, or convince an Ashan patrol that engaging was against their own rules. It would not always work. It had never been tested in a real battle before. But she believed, based on years of watching Ashan fleets behave exactly the same way over and over again, that it would work often enough to matter. Vale pointed out that Fleet Command clearly did not expect much from this mission, since it had been labeled low priority and handed to a crew nobody else wanted. Reyes agreed with him honestly. Nobody expected them to succeed. That, she said, was exactly why they had room to try something nobody else would be allowed to attempt. If they failed, the fleet lost nothing it valued. If they succeeded, they would have proof of something far more important than one small ship. They would have proof that the Ashan could be beaten without needing to build another Colossus at all. She looked out at the stars through the main viewport, thinking about the Colossus, about Admiral Cade, about 4,000 people who had died because a rulebook told an alien fleet exactly where to strike and exactly when to stop. She thought about a species that had never once had to improvise its way out of a bad situation because no situation had ever required it to. That, she decided, was about to change. Set a course for the Halden Reach, Reyes said, quietly. Let's go see what happens when the rules stop making sense. The supply outpost near the edge of the Halden Reach was called Kepler Station 9. a small mining and refueling post that supported human ships passing through the border region. It had no real defenses of its own, only a handful of light patrol ships and a few automated turrets meant to scare off pirates, not warships. When sensors picked up an Ashan patrol moving toward the station, the outpost commander sent an urgent request for support, expecting nothing but bad news. Instead, he got the UES Mockingbird. Captain Elena Reyes studied the sensor data as her ship approached the outpost. The Ashan patrol was made up of 4 ships, all mid-sized cruisers, nothing close to the size of the fleet that had destroyed the Colossus. But 4 Ashan cruisers were still more than enough to destroy Kepler Station 9 if they decided to attack, and far more than the Mockingbird could fight off directly. Lieutenant Tomas Vale looked at the numbers on his console and did not try to hide his concern. If they engage us directly, we lose. That's not pessimism, Captain. That's just the math. I know, Reyes said. So we make sure they don't want to. She had spent the 3-day journey to the outpost, studying every recorded Ashan engagement fleet intelligence had on file, going back almost 6 years. A pattern emerged that confirmed what she had suspected for a long time. Ashan patrol ships almost never engaged a target unless their own numbers were clearly superior, or unless a pattern keeper on board specifically authorized an exception. A patrol of 4 ships encountering what looked like an equal or larger human force usually withdrew to request reinforcements rather than risk an uncertain fight. It was not fear exactly, it was procedure. Ashan soldiers who attacked without following the correct authorization, and lost, could be blamed for the failure in a way that soldiers who retreated correctly never were. Reyes had a plan, built entirely around that one detail. Chief Engineer Sana Okoro had spent the last 3 days preparing the ship's sensor decoy systems for exactly this kind of situation. The Mockingbird could not fire enough weapons to look dangerous, but it could broadcast false sensor signatures convincing enough to make 4 Ashan cruisers believe they were approaching a much larger force. Okoro's team layered fake engine signatures, fake weapon charge readings, and fake communication traffic across a wide area of space around the station, creating the illusion of 6 additional warships hidden just beyond sensor range, waiting. It was not a perfect trick. A close inspection would reveal the truth quickly. But Ashan patrol ships, following procedure, tended to scan from a cautious distance first and request confirmation before closing in, exactly the kind of habit Reyes was counting on. When the Ashan patrol arrived within scanning range of Kepler Station 9, their sensors reported 10 warships defending the outpost, arranged in a loose but confident formation. The 4 Ashan cruisers slowed their approach immediately. On board the lead Ashan cruiser, a mid-ranking officer named Overkeeper Vren Tal studied the readings with growing unease. Vren Tal was young for his rank, promoted quickly after several successful patrols, and known among his peers for following the first pattern with unusually strict discipline, even by Ashan standards. He had memorized entire sections of the ancient text most officers only skimmed. He believed, deeply and sincerely, that the pattern had never failed the Ashan people, because it had never needed to be questioned. Vren Tal had grown up on one of the older Ashan worlds, in a family that had produced pattern keepers for 6 generations. As a child, he had been taught the pattern not as a set of tactics, but as a kind of inheritance, something passed down carefully, the way some human families pass down land or money. His grandfather had told him stories about ancestors who followed the pattern perfectly, even in hopeless situations, choosing an honorable, correct defeat over a disorganized, dishonorable retreat that broke procedure. Those stories were told with pride, not sadness. To Vren Tal, and to almost every Ashan he had ever served with, the pattern was not a limitation. It was the entire reason the Ashan Dominion had survived and grown for as long as it had, expanding steadily across dozens of star systems without ever losing the discipline that made its military so consistently effective. He had never once, in his entire career, seen a situation the pattern failed to describe clearly. The sensor readings in front of him described a defensive formation nearly 3 times the size of his own patrol. Engaging without requesting reinforcements would violate a clear section of the pattern regarding minimum acceptable force ratios. Vren Tal ordered his patrol to hold position at the edge of scanning range and sent a formal request for additional ships from the nearest Ashan command post, exactly as he had been trained to do since childhood. On board the Mockingbird, Devon Ashworth intercepted the Ashan communication and translated it within minutes, using decryption tools built specifically for this kind of work. Reyes read the translated message twice to make sure she understood it correctly. The Ashan patrol was requesting reinforcements before proceeding. They believed the illusion completely. "They're not attacking," Ashworth reported. "They're calling for backup." Reyes felt something she had not expected to feel this early. A small, careful flicker of confidence. The theory she had argued for years, the theory that had gotten her quietly removed from fleet intelligence, was holding up exactly as she had predicted. But calling for backup created a new problem. If Ashan reinforcements arrived and discovered the truth, 4 ships would become many more, and the illusion would collapse instantly. Reyes needed the patrol to withdraw entirely, not simply wait for support. She turned to Vale. Time until reinforcements could realistically arrive. Vale checked the data on nearby Ashan fleet positions that intelligence had tracked over recent weeks. Closest confirmed presence is roughly 11 hours out, assuming they respond immediately. 11 hours was enough time to make a second move. Reyes had Ashworth prepare a false transmission, disguised using intercepted Ashan communication codes gathered from previous encounters, describing the arrival of a larger human relief fleet, already inbound to the outpost, a force supposedly capable of overwhelming any reinforcements the Ashan might send. It was a risk. If the Ashan detected the deception at this stage, the entire operation could fail immediately, and possibly reveal far more about human capabilities than Reyes wanted to share this early. Ashworth transmitted the false signal using a frequency and format the Ashan patrol would recognize as belonging to their own long-range relay network, making it appear as though the message had been intercepted from human channels rather than sent directly to them, a subtle trick meant to make the information feel discovered rather than delivered. Vrental received the intercepted signal within the hour. It described a human relief fleet 3 times larger than his own patrol, already approaching from a nearby system. Combined with the sensor readings he had already gathered showing 10 defending warships at the outpost itself, the picture forming in front of him was clear. Engaging here, now, without significant additional support, would violate every rule about acceptable risk the pattern laid out. Worse, if reinforcements arrived only to find an overwhelming defending force already waiting, the mission would fail regardless, and Vrental himself would be the officer who requested reinforcements into a losing battle, a mark against his record that would follow him for years. He made the only decision the pattern allowed him to make in a situation like this. He ordered the patrol to withdraw completely, cancel the request for reinforcements, and report the outpost as too heavily defended for the resources currently available in the sector. The 4 Ashan cruisers turned and left Kepler Station 9 without firing a single shot. On board the Mockingbird, the bridge crew watched the Ashan patrol retreat on their sensors in something close to disbelief. Vale ran the numbers twice, checking for any sign that the Ashan ships were repositioning for a different kind of attack, rather than truly leaving. They were not. They were gone. "It worked," Okoro said quietly, almost to herself. Reyes allowed herself a small, careful smile, though she did not relax completely. One successful bluff against a single patrol did not prove anything definitively. It was possible the Ashan simply had other priorities elsewhere. It was possible this particular patrol commander was unusually cautious. She needed more data before she could be confident the pattern would hold against a wider range of Ashan forces. She sent a full report back to Fleet Admiral Osei that same day, describing exactly what had happened and exactly how the deception had been constructed. She expected the report to be met with polite interest and little else. Most senior officers in the fleet had already decided the Mockingbird project was a minor curiosity at best, and one successful bluff against 4 ships would not likely change many minds. She was partly right. Most of Fleet Command paid little attention to the report, but Osei read it carefully, several times, comparing it against the recorded Ashan communication logs Ashworth had included. She had spent years reading battle reports, describing raw force meeting raw force, ships trading fire until one side ran out of ships. This report described something completely different. An entire enemy patrol talked out of a fight without a single shot being fired, using nothing but false signals and a careful understanding of how the enemy thought. Osei did not immediately give Reyes a larger mission. She was cautious by nature, and one small success at an unimportant outpost was not enough to justify a major change in strategy. But she quietly authorized additional resources for the Mockingbird's continued testing, and she asked Fleet Intelligence to gather everything they could on any Ashan officer named Vren Tal, curious whether this particular commander would report the strange incident to his own superiors, and if so, how. He did report it. Ashan military culture required detailed reports on any mission that did not go according to expectation, and withdrawing from an assignment counted as exactly that kind of deviation. Vren Tal filed a careful, honest account describing the sensor readings, the intercepted communication, and his decision to withdraw in accordance with proper procedure regarding force ratios. His report reached a senior pattern keeper named Ashet Vral, an older officer responsible for reviewing unusual incidents across several patrol sectors. Ashet Vral read the report twice, noting something that troubled her slightly. The description of the human defensive formation and the supposed relief fleet did not match any previously recorded human deployment pattern in that region. It was possible the humans had simply moved ships quickly. It was also possible something else had happened, something Ashet Vral did not have a clear explanation for. She filed the incident as unusual but not immediately concerning, recommending increased caution for future patrols in that sector, and moved on to other reports. The Ashan military handled hundreds of incidents every week across a vast war effort. One strange withdrawal, with no ships lost and no clear evidence of deception, did not seem worth deeper investigation, not yet. But strange reports kept arriving over the following weeks, from different patrols, in different sectors, each one small and easy to dismiss on its own. A patrol near a mining claim reporting a command message ordering it away, a message that Ashan command records showed no trace of actually sending. A listening post reporting a moment of confusion over whether an advance order had truly come from its own superior officer. A patrol near a minefield that, upon later inspection, contained no mines at all. Ashet Vral began collecting these reports in a separate file of her own, not yet convinced they were connected, but uneasy about how often the word confusion appeared in official Ashan military reports, a word that almost never appeared in such reports before the loss of the human flagship at Halden Reach. She raised the matter once, carefully, with a senior council member during a routine briefing, suggesting that recent patrol reports showed an unusual pattern of small, unexplained incidents worth tracking. The council member, a rigid traditionalist named High Keeper Dessa Orun, listened politely, and then dismissed the concern almost immediately. The pattern had guided the Ashan Dominion for longer than recorded history could properly measure, Orun said. It had survived contact with a dozen different species before the humans, and it would survive contact with the humans as well. A handful of confused patrol officers was not evidence of anything beyond ordinary human tricks, the kind every enemy tried sooner or later, and the kind the pattern had always accounted for. Ashet Vral did not argue further, though she kept her private file regardless, unable to fully shake the feeling that something about these incidents was different from ordinary wartime confusion. Reyes did not know any of this at the time. She only knew that her ship had survived its first real test, and that the theory she had defended for years, quietly, against officers who dismissed her, had produced a real result at last. Over the following weeks, Fleet Admiral Osei authorized 3 more small missions for the Mockingbird, each one testing a slightly different version of the same basic idea. In one encounter near a remote listening post, Ashworth intercepted and slightly altered an Ashan patrol's own communication before relaying it back, creating a brief but real moment of confusion among the patrol's officers about whether an order to advance had actually been given by their own command. In another encounter, Okoro's decoy systems created the illusion of a damaged human ship broadcasting a distress signal in a heavily mined stretch of space, causing an Ashan patrol to alter its course entirely, rather than risk navigating what its sensors falsely suggested was a dangerous minefield. In a fourth encounter, near a quiet asteroid mining claim, Reyes tried something more ambitious. Instead of simply making the Mockingbird look larger or more dangerous than it was, Ashworth crafted a false internal communication, made to look like it came from a senior Ashan command post, ordering a nearby patrol to reroute away from the claim entirely, for reasons the message described only as matters requiring separate authorization. The patrol commander, unwilling to question what appeared to be a direct order from a superior officer, rerouted immediately, without asking for clarification, exactly the kind of unquestioning obedience Reyes had come to expect. It was a small deception, and a risky one, since impersonating a Shan command communication directly, rather than simply intercepting or altering existing signals, was a much bolder move than anything attempted before. But it worked, and it worked cleanly, without any sign that the Ashan patrol suspected anything unusual had happened at all. Each mission was small. None of them destroyed a single Ashan ship. None of them made headlines, or earned Reyes any praise from senior officers who still considered the Mockingbird a strange, low-priority project. But each mission added another piece of evidence to the same conclusion. The Ashan did not adapt quickly to situations their doctrine had not already described. They hesitated. They requested confirmation. They followed procedure exactly as they had been trained to, even when following procedure meant walking away from opportunities a more flexible enemy might have taken. Reyes began keeping her own private notes, separate from the official reports, describing what she was starting to believe was the deepest weakness in the entire Ashan military system. It was not a weakness of courage, or skill, or technology. The Ashan were brave, skilled, and technologically advanced in many ways. Their weakness was trust, an absolute, unquestioning trust in a set of rules so old and so deeply respected that no one dared to imagine those rules might ever need to change. A rule followed without question was a strength when the situation matched the rule exactly. It became a dangerous blind spot the moment the situation did not. 4 months after the loss of the Colossus, Fleet Admiral Osei called Reyes back to Earth for a longer meeting, one that involved several other senior officers Reyes had not expected to be included. The government was growing impatient. Public opinion, still shaken by the destruction of the Colossus, wanted decisive victories, not small, quiet incidents at remote outposts nobody outside the fleet had heard of. Osei needed to show something bigger, something that would prove the Mockingbird's approach could matter on a larger scale, not just in small, isolated encounters far from any real front line. "There's a colony chain near the Thren corridor," Osei said, laying out a star map in front of the assembled officers. 3 settlements, 12,000 people combined. Fleet intelligence believes an Ashan strike force is preparing to move against them within the next several weeks, in retaliation for a supply raid we conducted last month. Reyes studied the map carefully. A colony chain defense was a very different kind of mission from a single outpost with a handful of ships. It would involve a real Ashan strike force, likely dozens of ships, supported by actual combat vessels, rather than a small patrol looking for an excuse to avoid a fight. One of the other officers in the room, a stern fleet strategist named Commodore Halverson, spoke up before Reyes could respond. "With respect, Admiral, we are talking about 12,000 civilians. This is not the place to test an unproven theory, built on a handful of lucky bluffs against small patrols. Send a proper defense fleet. Send the Mockingbird along if you like, as a support asset, but do not make it the center of this plan. The proper defense fleet you are describing does not exist anymore, Commodore," Osei said evenly. "Not after the Halden Reach. We do not have another Colossus. We have what we have, and what we have is stretched thin across a dozen sectors. I am not asking whether this is comfortable. I am asking whether it can work." Halverson did not look convinced, but he did not argue further. Reyes appreciated that Osei had not pretended the decision was easy, and had not oversold the Mockingbird's chances either. It made the responsibility feel heavier, not lighter, and Reyes found that she preferred it that way. "You want the Mockingbird there," Reyes said. "I want to know if what worked on a patrol of 4 ships can work on a strike force of 40, Osei said. "If it can, we may have found something more valuable than another Colossus. If it can't, we will know that too, before we risk something we cannot afford to lose twice." Reyes understood exactly what was being asked of her, and exactly what was at stake. 12,000 civilians, an untested theory scaled up far beyond anything she had tried before. A crew that had proven themselves capable in small encounters, but never in anything close to a real battle. She thought about Admiral Cade, about the Colossus, about 4,000 people who had died because an enemy fleet followed its own rules perfectly, right up until those rules delivered exactly the outcome the Ashan wanted. "Send us," Reyes said. "We'll be ready." The Thren corridor was a narrow, busy stretch of space, connecting 3 human colonies to the rest of settled territory. Nearly 12,000 people lived across the 3 settlements. most of them farmers, miners, and their families. People who had chosen life on the edge of human space, because it was quieter and cheaper than life closer to Earth. None of them had expected the war to reach this far. Not directly. Not with an actual strike force. The largest of the three settlements, a farming town called New Meridian, had grown up around a single water reclamation plant that supplied fresh water to the whole corridor. Its mayor, an older woman named Grace Odom, had lived through two smaller Ashan raids years earlier, before the war reached this far out, and had helped rebuild the town both times. When word of the incoming strike force reached her, she did not panic. She began organizing evacuation shelters exactly as she had before, quietly hoping that whatever help the fleet could send would be enough, without letting herself believe too strongly that it would be. Most of the 12,000 people across the three settlements had no ships of their own, no way to leave in time even if they wanted to. Whatever happened at the Thren corridor, they would live through it, or not, from the ground. Fleet intelligence confirmed the threat 6 days before the expected attack. A large Ashan force, at least 40 ships, was gathering just beyond the corridor, preparing what analysts believed was a retaliation strike for a human supply raid conducted weeks earlier. Fleet Admiral Osei could not spare a full battle fleet for the defense. Most of humanity's remaining warships were stretched thin, holding other fronts, still recovering from losses suffered since the destruction of the Colossus. What she could spare was a modest escort force of 12 ships, none of them especially powerful on their own, along with the UES Mockingbird. Command of the escort force went to Captain Daniel Reyes, no relation to Elena Reyes, an experienced but conventional officer who had spent most of his career commanding standard warships and had little patience for unconventional tactics. He had been briefed on the Mockingbird's purpose, and he did not hide his skepticism. "I've read your reports," he told Elena Reyes during their first joint briefing, 3 days before the Ashan force was expected to arrive. "Tricks and signals. Fine, against patrols that didn't want to fight anyway. This is 40 warships coming to destroy 3 settlements on purpose. You think signals are going to stop that?" "I don't think signals alone will stop 40 ships," Elena said. "I think confusion, applied at the right moment, combined with everything your escort force can bring to bear, gives us a real chance where firepower alone would not." Daniel Reyes was not convinced, but he did not have a better plan either, and Osei's orders were clear enough. He agreed to let the Mockingbird operate independently during the engagement, coordinating through Elena's team, rather than folding directly into his own chain of command, an arrangement that satisfied neither man's instincts, but was the only compromise available given the timeline. "Understand something," Daniel said, before the briefing ended. "If your tricks fail, and my ships get caught out of position, because we were waiting on your signal, that's 12,000 people who pay for it. I'll follow the plan because command told me to. That doesn't mean I like it." Elena did not argue with him. She had heard variations of the same warning from other officers before, and she understood exactly why the warning was fair. Unlike her earlier missions, this time there was no quiet outpost with no witnesses if the plan failed. There were 3 towns full of people who had nowhere else to go. "If it fails," she said, "you'll see it fail early, and you'll still have time to fight the battle your way. I'm not asking you to trust the trick. I'm asking you to use the time it buys." Daniel studied her for a long moment, before nodding once. Not quite in agreement, but not a refusal either. Elena spent the 3 days before the attack studying everything fleet intelligence had gathered on the incoming Ashan force. The fleet was led by a senior commander whose identity intelligence had not yet confirmed, supported by several pattern keepers responsible for approving any deviation from standard doctrine during the engagement. 40 ships was a large enough force that the Ashan would likely follow a well-established attack doctrine rather than anything experimental, beginning with a formal approach, a period of observation, and only then, a coordinated assault once the attacking commander was satisfied the target's defenses had been accurately measured. That period of observation, Elena believed, was the opportunity. Her plan this time was more ambitious than anything attempted before. Rather than simply making the human defense force look larger, which might not be convincing against a force already expecting resistance from a modest colonial escort, she planned to create confusion about the nature of the defense itself. Okoro's team prepared decoy signals representing several different classes of ship the Ashan had never encountered from humanity before, unfamiliar signatures that did not match any pattern in Ashan records. Ashworth prepared a set of false communications, timed to broadcast at key moments during the Ashan approach, designed to look like intercepted human command traffic discussing reinforcements, new weapon systems, and evacuation plans that did not actually exist. The goal was not to convince the Ashan fleet that a larger force stood ready to fight. 40 ships would likely not be dissuaded by simple numbers the way a patrol of 4 had been. The goal was to make the Ashan commander uncertain about what kind of engagement this actually was, uncertain enough that the standard doctrine for engaging a colonial defense force no longer clearly applied, forcing a request for clarification from a pattern keeper before any coordinated attack could proceed. Every minute spent waiting for that clarification was a minute the human defense force could use to prepare, reposition, and, if Elena's theory held, exploit whatever hesitation followed. The Ashan fleet arrived at the edge of the Thren corridor exactly on schedule, 3 days later. It was led by a full overkeeper named Doran Kesh, a seasoned commander who had led dozens of successful engagements over his long career. Kesh had fought humans before, at 2 earlier colonial raids much like this one, and both times the outcome had gone exactly as Doctrine predicted: a brief, one-sided engagement, followed by an orderly withdrawal of any human ships still capable of retreating. He expected this engagement to look much the same. 40 ships against 12 was not, in his experience, a fight at all. It was a formality, one his own crew had grown almost casually confident about during the journey out. Kesh approached the human defense line cautiously, following standard procedure, ordering his fleet to hold at a measured distance while sensors gathered a complete picture of the enemy force. What his sensors reported did not match anything in his experience. Alongside the 12 recognizable human escort ships, sensors detected 6 additional signatures, unlike any known human warship class. Their engine signatures unusually quiet, their weapon signatures inconsistent with any previously observed human technology. At the same time, intercepted communication traffic, picked up through routine monitoring of human channels, described reinforcements en route, along with references to something called Project Threshold, a name that appeared nowhere in Ashan intelligence records. Kesh was an experienced commander, and experienced commanders did not simply react to the first piece of unusual information. He ordered a pattern keeper on board his flagship, an older officer named HFY War, to review the situation and confirm whether the engagement still fell within standard doctrine for a colonial retaliation strike, or whether the unfamiliar signatures represented a new class of threat requiring escalation to full council authorization before proceeding. This was exactly the delay Elena had hoped for. HFY War took nearly 4 hours reviewing the sensor data, consulting historical records, and drafting a formal report before reaching a conclusion. He ultimately determined that the unfamiliar signatures, while unusual, did not clearly indicate a fundamentally new threat class, and recommended the engagement proceed under standard doctrine, with additional caution advised regarding the unidentified vessels. 4 hours was not a permanent solution to Elena's problem, but it was 4 hours the human defense force used well, repositioning ships, adjusting formations, and allowing the Mockingbird's decoy systems to prepare a second, more elaborate layer of deception before the Ashan fleet began its approach. When the Ashan fleet finally advanced, Kesh ordered a standard opening formation, a wide, coordinated approach meant to test the human defense line's response before committing to a full attack. Daniel Reyes's escort force held position exactly as briefed, allowing the Ashan fleet to close within engagement range without breaking formation prematurely, a discipline that surprised Kesh slightly, since most colonial defense forces in similar situations tended to either retreat immediately or scatter under pressure. At the moment the Ashan fleet crossed into what its own doctrine defined as effective engagement range, Elena gave the order for the second layer of deception. Ashworth broadcast a burst of false command traffic, disguised using communication codes captured and studied since the very first encounter with Vrental's patrol months earlier, describing an urgent order for the unfamiliar human vessels to begin Phase 2, a phrase carrying no clear meaning to anyone, human or Ashan, but deliberately styled to sound like a rehearsed, prepared response to exactly this kind of attack. At the same moment, Okoro's decoy systems altered the apparent engine signatures of the unfamiliar vessels, making them appear to power up weapon systems entirely unlike anything in Ashan combat records, systems that did not actually exist. The effect on the Ashan fleet was immediate and significant. Several ship captains, unable to identify what kind of attack Phase 2 might represent, and unwilling to advance into an unknown weapon system without explicit orders addressing the new threat, broke formation slightly, some slowing their approach, others requesting confirmation from Kesh's flagship before proceeding further. Kesh, watching his own fleet's coordination begin to fray, ordered his forces to hold formation and wait for Kelis Vor's updated assessment. But Kelis Vor, faced with sensor data describing weapon signatures with no precedent in Ashan records, along with intercepted communication referencing an unfamiliar operational phase, could not immediately confirm that the engagement still fell within standard doctrine. He requested additional time to consult deeper archive records, a request that, under strict Ashan procedure, Kesh could not simply override without risking a formal review of his own conduct later, regardless of how the battle turned out. The Ashan advance slowed to a crawl, ships holding position at the edge of engagement range, waiting for authorization that had not yet come. Daniel Reyes, watching the enemy fleet hesitate on his own sensors, understood an opportunity when he saw one, whatever his earlier doubts about Elena's methods. He ordered his escort force to press forward, taking advantage of the Ashan fleet's broken coordination to strike at its most exposed ships before the larger force could reorganize. The engagement that followed was fierce, but decisively different from what either side had expected going in. The human escort force, though smaller and individually weaker than the Ashan fleet, fought with the advantage of coordination against an enemy that had, for crucial minutes, lost its own. Several Ashan ships, caught between conflicting instincts to advance and conflicting orders to hold, found themselves isolated and unsupported when the human attack came. Two Ashan cruisers, attempting to compensate for the confusion by improvising an independent response, nearly collided with a third ship still holding its original position, an almost unthinkable failure of coordination for a fleet built entirely around precise rehearsed movement. The battle unfolded in three distinct waves. In the first, Daniel Reyes concentrated his escort force against the two isolated Ashan cruisers that had drifted furthest from Kesh's flagship during the confusion, destroying one outright and crippling the second before its escorts could reorganize enough to respond properly. In the second wave, as several Ashan captains finally received partial authorization to engage independently, a chaotic, uneven series of skirmishes broke out across the corridor, human ships using the narrow terrain of the corridor itself, thick with drifting mining debris from decades of local asteroid work, to break line of sight and avoid the Ashan fleet's usual coordinated fire patterns. By the third wave, Kesh had managed to reassert enough control over his remaining ships to organize a proper counterattack, and for a while, the battle became a much more even, brutal exchange, with both sides taking real losses. It was New Meridian's own defense grid, a handful of aging automated turrets, meant only to scare off pirates, that tipped the final exchange. Mayor Odom, watching the battle unfold on emergency broadcast feeds from the settlement's command shelter, made the call to bring every turret online and direct their limited fire at any Ashan ship that strayed within range of the colony itself, a contribution too small to matter against a fully coordinated fleet. But just enough, arriving at exactly the moment Kesh's ships were already stretched thin, to convince two more Ashan captains that continuing the engagement risked losses their own procedures no longer justified. The battle lasted just over 2 hours. When it ended, the Ashan fleet had lost 9 ships and was in full, disorganized retreat, a result no analyst on either side would have predicted from a straightforward comparison of raw firepower. The human defense force had lost 3 ships, a serious cost, but far lighter than anyone had expected against a force 3 times its size. Down on the surface, Grace Odom watched the last Ashan signatures fade from the command shelter's tracking display and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 days, to sit down. On board the Mockingbird, the bridge crew watched the retreat unfold in something between exhaustion and disbelief. Vale, checking and rechecking sensor data, finally allowed himself to sit back in his chair. "They had us outnumbered more than 3 to 1, he said, "and we won." "We didn't win because we were stronger," Elena said quietly. "We won because for about 20 minutes, they didn't know how to fight anymore." That phrase stayed with her long after the battle ended. Aboard the retreating Ashan flagship, Overkeeper Doran Kesh reviewed the engagement with a growing sense of unease that went beyond simple frustration at a lost battle. The pattern accounted for losses, provided proper procedure had been followed throughout. What troubled Kesh was not the defeat itself, but the fact that his own fleet, following every rule correctly, had still fallen apart at the exact moment it needed coordination most. He filed a detailed report for council review, describing unfamiliar enemy signatures, intercepted communications referencing operational concepts with no precedent in Ashan intelligence, and a breakdown in fleet coordination that no section of the pattern adequately explained. That report eventually reached HFY, the same senior pattern keeper who had quietly begun tracking similar incidents months earlier. Reading Kesh's account alongside her growing private file of earlier confusions, she felt the same unease deepen into something closer to certainty. These incidents were not isolated accidents or unusual human luck. Someone on the human side had found a way to create confusion deliberately, repeatedly, and with growing sophistication, striking directly at the one part of Ashan military culture nobody had ever needed to defend before: absolute confidence in the pattern's ability to describe any situation correctly. She brought her full file to High Keeper Dessa Orun for a second time, this time with far more evidence than a handful of strange patrol reports. Orun read through the material carefully, his expression unreadable. He did not dismiss the concern as easily this time, though he still resisted the deeper implication HFY was cautiously suggesting, that the pattern itself, in its rigid unwillingness to account for deliberate deception, might contain a vulnerability the ancestors who wrote it had never imagined an enemy could exploit. "You are suggesting the pattern has a flaw," Orun said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "I am suggesting an enemy has found one," HFY replied. "Whether that is the same thing, I do not yet know." Orun did not answer immediately. For the first time since the war with humanity began, a senior Ashan official sat with the possibility, however unwelcome, that the doctrine guiding every soldier under his command might not be as complete as generations of Ashan history had always assumed. "What would you have me do?" Orun said eventually. "Tell every commander in the fleet to stop trusting their own censors, stop trusting orders from their own council. That is not caution, HFY. That is the collapse of everything that holds this fleet together." "I am not asking you to stop trusting the pattern," she said carefully. "I am asking you to let us study what happens when an enemy learns to speak its language well enough to lie in it. If we do not understand that now, while it costs us ships, we may be forced to understand it later, when it costs us far more." Orun gave no promises that day, but he did not close the file either. He asked HFY to continue her review quietly, without alarming the wider fleet, and to bring him anything further she found, before taking the matter to full council. It was a small concession, far short of what she believed the situation required, but it was the first crack in a wall of certainty that had never once needed defending before. Word of the human victory at the Thren corridor reached Fleet Admiral Osei within a day. She read the full report from both Daniel Reyes and Elena Reyes carefully, comparing the tactical outcome against the cost. 3 ships lost, against 9 Ashan ships destroyed, and a full retreat, achieved with an escort force that should not, by any conventional measure, have been able to hold against 40 attacking warships. She called Elena Reyes back to Earth once more, this time not to question whether the Mockingbird's approach could work on a larger scale, but to plan exactly how far it could be pushed. "You bought your escort force 20 minutes of confusion," Osei said, studying the battle data laid out between them. "What happens if we can buy an entire fleet that same 20 minutes, at the front where it matters most?" Elena thought about Vrental's quiet retreat months earlier, about the 4 hours Kellis Vor had spent unable to confirm a simple engagement, about 9 Ashan ships destroyed, not by superior firepower, but by an enemy that briefly forgot how coordinated combat was supposed to work at all. "I think we're about to find out," she said. 6 months after the battle at the Thren corridor, the war reached a point that both sides quietly understood as a turning moment, even if neither side said so openly. Fleet Admiral Osei had used the time since the corridor battle carefully. She expanded the Mockingbird's crew, approved construction of 2 additional ships built on similar principles, and slowly began weaving deception and confusion tactics into the training of regular fleet officers, not as a replacement for firepower, but as a tool to be used alongside it. Captain Elena Reyes, once a quietly punished officer nobody expected much from, now sat in briefings that decided the direction of the entire war effort. On the Ashan side, the growing unease that had started with a single strange patrol report had not gone away. HFY's private file had grown into a formal, if still limited, review effort, quietly authorized by High Keeper Dessa Orun. She had identified at least 11 incidents across the past year that shared the same signature, confusion introduced at exactly the moment it would do the most damage, always through channels the Ashan trusted completely, sensor readings, communications, procedure itself. She had not yet found a way to stop it. She had only found enough evidence to prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that it was happening deliberately. HFY had, by this point, developed a working theory she had not yet dared present to full council. She believed the human deceptions succeeded not because Ashan soldiers were foolish, but because the pattern gave them no acceptable way to act on suspicion alone. An Ashan officer who noticed something strange, but could not immediately prove it false through proper channels, was trained to wait, to verify, to request authorization, rather than trust his own instinct and act. Humans, she suspected, operated differently, more willing to act on a hunch and accept the risk of being wrong. It was not a flattering theory, and it was not one High Keeper Dessa Orun wanted to hear repeated in front of the wider council, since it suggested the pattern's greatest strength, its demand for careful verification before action, had become, against this particular enemy, a liability that no individual soldier's courage could fix alone. The Ashan Dominion's response, when it came, was not subtle. Council leadership, still resistant to any suggestion that the pattern itself needed to change, decided the correct response to an enemy exploiting hesitation was to remove hesitation entirely. A massive strike fleet was assembled, more than 120 ships, placed under the command of the newly promoted High Overkeeper, Doran Kesh, the same officer who had lost 9 ships at the Thren Corridor, and had spent the months since studying that defeat obsessively. Kesh's orders were direct. Advance on the human forward base at Corvan Station, a heavily defended staging point close to human core territory, and destroy it decisively, using overwhelming force applied so quickly that no amount of confusion could slow the outcome. Corvan Station was, in many ways, humanity's version of the Halden Reach, a place where losing badly would open a direct path toward Earth's outer colonies. Fleet Admiral Osei understood what was coming, almost as soon as intelligence confirmed the size of the assembling Ashan fleet. She could not match 120 ships with conventional firepower alone, not without stripping every other front of its defenses. She called Elena Reyes to Corvan Station personally, along with Daniel Reyes and several other senior officers who had, over the past 6 months, become cautiously convinced that the Mockingbird's approach was not a curiosity, but a real weapon. "This is the fight we've been building toward," Osei told the assembled officers. "Kesh knows what happened at the corridor. He will not make the same mistake twice. Whatever we try here, we should assume he has already thought about it." Daniel Reyes, present at the briefing, as the officer who would command Corvan Station's main defense fleet, studied the numbers grimly. 120 ships, he said. "Even with everything we've learned since the corridor, that's not a fight we win with tricks and good timing alone." "No," Osei agreed. "This time it has to be both. Real firepower, positioned well, and whatever confusion Captain Reyes can buy us. Neither one wins this alone anymore. I want that understood by everyone in this room before we commit to a plan." She looked around at the assembled officers, several of whom, 6 months earlier, would have argued strongly against giving the Mockingbird's methods this much weight, in a battle this important. Nobody argued now. The corridor had settled that argument for them, even if not everyone in the room had fully admitted it out loud. Elena had assumed exactly that from the moment she saw the size of the incoming fleet. A single trick, however clever, would not work twice against a commander who had studied his own defeat carefully. She spent the 2 weeks before the battle designing something far more layered than anything attempted before. Not one deception, but several, stacked on top of each other, each one designed to fail believably, in a way that concealed the next. The core of her plan depended on something she had come to understand deeply over the past year of small victories. The Ashan military did not fail simply because individual soldiers were confused. It failed because confusion at the top of the chain of command spread downward, forcing every officer below to wait for clarity that was slow to arrive, since no one dared act without proper authorization. If Elena could create doubt not just about the battlefield itself, but about the authority giving orders during the battle. The entire fleet's coordination could collapse from the inside, regardless of how prepared any individual captain was. It was an enormous risk. If the plan failed, if Kesh saw through it quickly, Corvin Station would face 120 ships, with nothing standing between it and destruction, except a defense force already stretched thin. The Ashan fleet arrived at Corvin Station 11 days later, in a formation Kesh had personally designed to prevent the kind of fragmentation his fleet suffered at the Thren corridor. Rather than a single unified approach, he divided his force into 4 independent battle groups, each with its own command structure and its own pattern keeper, authorized to make limited tactical decisions without waiting for confirmation from his flagship. It was, by Ashan standards, an unusually flexible arrangement, a direct response to the lesson Kesh had drawn from his previous defeat. He had concluded, correctly, that centralizing every decision through a single point of authorization had been part of what allowed confusion to freeze his entire fleet before. Distributing that authority across 4 groups, he believed, would prevent any single trick from paralyzing the whole force again. Elena had anticipated exactly this kind of adaptation, and it worried her more than anything else about the coming battle. Kesh was not simply following old doctrine blindly anymore. He was learning, adjusting, thinking in ways the rigid Ashan culture rarely produced. If the Ashan military as a whole began adapting this quickly, the advantage the Mockingbird's tactics provided would not last much longer. In the weeks leading up to Corvin Station, Kesh had done something almost unheard of among Ashan commanders. He had requested, and received, special permission to study the corridor engagement in far greater detail than a normal after-action review usually allowed, interviewing surviving officers personally, reconstructing the exact sequence of confusion that had cost him 9 ships. He had concluded, correctly, that the danger was not the specific tricks used against him, the false minefield, the fake command traffic, but the single point of failure his own command structure had created, one authority whose hesitation paralyzed everyone beneath it. His new formation was his answer to that specific lesson, an answer built from genuine reflection rather than blind repetition of doctrine, something few Ashan officers before him had ever been encouraged, or even permitted, to do. The battle began with the 4 Ashan battle groups advancing on Corvin Station from different directions, exactly as Kesh had planned, each group capable of responding independently to whatever the human defense force attempted. Daniel Reyes, now commanding a larger defense fleet built specifically around Corvin Station, held his ships in a flexible formation, designed to react to whichever Ashan group pressed hardest, while Elena's expanded team, now operating from 2 coordinated ships instead of 1, prepared their layered deception. The first layer targeted the northernmost Ashan battle group, using decoy signals to suggest a hidden minefield directly in its projected path, similar to a trick used months earlier, deliberately familiar in a way Elena hoped would feel, to Kesh's officers, like an old lesson already learned rather than a new threat. The group's pattern keeper, aware of the earlier minefield deception and confident in his ability to recognize it, ordered a careful sensor sweep before proceeding, exactly as Elena predicted, and confirmed correctly that no real mines existed. The group resumed its advance within 20 minutes, only slightly delayed, and considerably more confident that it had successfully seen through a repeated trick. That confidence was exactly what Elena wanted. The second layer, activated moments after the northern group resumed its advance, was a false communication, disguised using codes gathered from over a dozen previous intercepts, describing an emergency override transferring temporary command authority for that sector to a pattern keeper whose name did not match anyone actually serving in Kesh's fleet. A name drawn instead from historical Ashan records of a legendary pattern keeper from centuries earlier, a figure every Ashan officer would recognize by reputation, but none would expect to encounter serving in the present day. The message was riddled with small inconsistencies, deliberately included, designed to be dismissed quickly as a low-level deception, exactly the kind Kesh's officers had already learned to recognize and set aside without much concern. But while the Northern Group's officers were busy dismissing an obvious fake, a third, much subtler layer went active elsewhere. Ashworth's team quietly altered the timestamp and origin data on a real, legitimate tactical update Kesh's flagship had sent to all 4 battle groups only minutes earlier, making it appear, to the Western battle group alone, that the update had arrived several minutes late and slightly out of sequence with other fleet communications. It was a small, almost invisible manipulation, nothing dramatic enough to trigger the kind of obvious suspicion the Northern group's fake message had. But it was enough to make the Western group's pattern keeper pause and request confirmation that the update he had received matched what Kesh's flagship had actually sent. A routine, sensible check that nonetheless took several minutes to resolve, minutes during which the Western group's coordination with the other three fell slightly, quietly, out of step. It was not the dramatic fleet-wide freeze Elena had achieved at the Thren corridor. Kesh's distributed command structure prevented that, but it was something different, and in some ways more dangerous to the Ashan fleet's coordination. Instead of one large hesitation, the human deception created four smaller, staggered hesitations, each one small enough to seem manageable on its own, but together, pulling the four battle groups slightly out of the precise timing Kesh's attack plan depended on. Daniel Reyes, watching the Ashan formation drift subtly out of alignment on his own sensors, adjusted his defense fleet's response in real time, concentrating firepower against the Western group during its brief lag, then shifting quickly toward the Northern group as its own confidence-driven advance outpaced its supporting units. It was a demanding, fast-moving battle, requiring constant coordination between the human defense fleet and Elena's team. Nothing like the single decisive moment at the corridor. But slowly, methodically, the human forces began inflicting damage disproportionate to their numbers, striking each Ashan group during its own small window of reduced coordination, before that group's officers fully realigned with the rest of the fleet. Aboard his flagship, Kesh watched his carefully designed distributed formation begin to fray in ways he had not anticipated, and felt something close to real fear for the first time since the war began. He had built his entire strategy around preventing a single, fleet-wide freeze. He had not considered that his enemy might not need one, that four smaller stumbles, timed just right, could cost him nearly as much as one large collapse. He made a decision that no section of the pattern he had memorized as a young officer had ever described. Rather than waiting for his pattern keepers to resolve each small confusion through proper procedure, he issued direct orders overriding their authority, instructing all four battle groups to ignore any communication not directly verified through his own personal command channel, and to proceed with the original attack plan, regardless of minor inconsistencies in secondary reports. It was, by any strict reading of Ashan doctrine, close to heresy, a senior commander instructing his own officers to disregard the very verification procedures the pattern existed to enforce. Kesh knew it, and gave the order anyway, understanding that following procedure correctly, in this moment, was leading his fleet toward exactly the kind of failure procedure was meant to prevent. The order worked, in the sense that it restored coordination among his battle groups within minutes. But it came at a cost Kesh had not fully anticipated. Word of a high overkeeper personally overriding pattern keeper authority spread through the fleet's communication channels almost immediately, whispered between crews who had never once, in their entire service, heard of a commander doing such a thing. Some officers followed the new orders without hesitation, trusting Kesh's judgment completely. Others hesitated, uncertain whether following a command that explicitly bypassed proper verification procedure might itself be treated as a failure later, regardless of the battle's outcome, a fear the pattern had spent centuries instilling in every soldier who served under it. That hesitation, small as it was, gave Elena's team one final opportunity. Ashworth, monitoring the sudden spike in confused internal Ashan communication following Kesh's override, crafted one last transmission, this one deliberately simple, almost crude, compared to the layered deceptions used earlier in the battle. It claimed to be a reminder, broadcast fleet-wide from a senior pattern keeper's office, that unauthorized overrides of verification procedure, regardless of rank, remained subject to full council review after any engagement. It was not even clear whether the message was true. Elena had built it using real historical precedent, a genuine but rarely invoked rule buried deep in Ashan military law, one Ashworth's research had uncovered weeks earlier while studying captured Ashan legal archives. The message did not need to be false to cause damage. It only needed to be plausible enough to make already uncertain officers hesitate one moment longer than they otherwise would have, weighing loyalty to their commander against fear of a review process that could end careers, or worse. That single moment of hesitation, spread unevenly across dozens of ships at once, was enough. Daniel Reyes's defense fleet, watching the Ashan formation stutter one final time, pressed the advantage decisively, concentrating fire against the most exposed ships in each battle group before they could recover. The battle at Corvin Station lasted nearly 5 hours, far longer and far bloodier than the Thren Corridor engagement. When it ended, the Ashan fleet had lost 38 ships and was retreating in a disorganized, fractured formation that bore little resemblance to the disciplined force that had arrived that morning. The human defense fleet had lost 17 ships, a heavy price, but a price that had, for the first time since the loss of the Colossus, secured a clear and decisive strategic victory against a major Ashan offensive. Kesh survived the battle, though barely, his own flagship crippled and drifting by the time the retreat order finally went out. He would spend the following weeks facing exactly the kind of council review his own officers had feared, an inquiry into his decision to override Pattern Keeper authority during active combat, regardless of the fact that his fleet had ultimately survived, if not won. News of the victory at Corvin Station spread through human territory within days. It did not undo the loss of the Colossus, and it did not end the war on its own. But for the first time in years, ordinary people across human space heard a phrase repeated in news reports and military briefings that captured something the fleet's senior officers had come to understand slowly, one small engagement at a time. The Ashan had not lost at Corvan Station because they were weaker, or less brave, or less skilled than the humans facing them. They had lost because, for a handful of critical hours, an enemy that understood exactly how their own trust in procedure worked had made that trust itself into a weapon, and an entire fleet built around perfect coordination had, piece by piece, forgotten how to fight. Elena Reyes did not feel like celebrating when the reports came in. She sat alone in her quarters aboard the Mockingbird for a long while, thinking about 17 human ships lost, about crews she had never met who had died buying the time her deceptions needed to work. She thought too about Kesh, a commander who had learned, adapted, and nearly beaten her anyway, undone in the end not by his own mistakes, but by centuries of doctrine that punished him for trying to fix them in the moment they mattered most. Daniel Reyes found her there some hours later, still sitting quietly with the lights dimmed low. He had never fully trusted her methods, not completely, even after the corridor. He sat down across from her without being invited, an unusual gesture for a man who rarely showed much softness to officers he outranked. 17 ships, he said. That's the number everyone's going to remember when they write the history of this battle, not the 38 we cost them. Ours. I know, Elena said. For what it's worth, Daniel said. I don't think we'd have a Corvin Station left to defend if you hadn't been here. I wasn't sure of that 6 months ago. I'm sure of it now. It was not quite an apology, and it was not quite praise either. But Elena understood it as the closest thing to both that Daniel Reyes was likely to offer, and she found, to her own surprise, that it mattered to her more than she expected. Word reached them the next morning that Kesh had survived, and that a formal council review of his conduct during the battle had already been ordered back on the Ashan homeworld. Elena read the intercepted report twice, feeling an unexpected flicker of something close to sympathy for a commander she had never met, and had spent 5 hours trying to defeat. Kesh had adapted faster than any Ashan officer she had studied. He had broken his own culture's most sacred rule to save his fleet, and he was going to be punished for it, regardless of how many of his people it had saved. She thought about what that meant for the war ahead. If the Ashan Dominion punished its own best officers for learning to think independently, the rigid system that made them so vulnerable might never truly change, no matter how many battles like Corvan Station humanity won. But, if enough officers like Kesh survived long enough, and rose high enough, something might shift from the inside that no amount of clever deception from the outside could ever force on its own. The war was not over. But something fundamental had shifted, on both sides, and Elena understood that the hardest part of what she had started was still ahead of her. The council review of High Overkeeper Doran Kesh lasted nearly 2 months, on the Ashan homeworld, in a chamber built centuries earlier, to hold exactly this kind of proceeding. Senior pattern keepers debated whether a commander who broke sacred procedure to save his fleet deserved punishment or praise. Ashet Vral testified at length, presenting her full file of confusion incidents, stretching back more than a year, arguing that Kesh's override, however unprecedented, had been the only rational response to an enemy that had learned to weaponize the pattern's own rules against it. Highkeeper Dessa Orun listened to every argument carefully, torn between centuries of tradition and evidence he could no longer honestly dismiss. During the proceedings, one elderly council member, a retired pattern keeper named Horan Vass, who had served the Dominion for nearly a century, asked HFY a question that quieted the chamber for a long moment. He asked whether she believed the pattern itself was the flaw, or whether the flaw was the Dominion's refusal, across all its long history, to ever imagine that an enemy might study the pattern as closely as the Ashan studied it themselves. HFY answered carefully, aware that her words would be recorded and repeated for generations of pattern keepers to come. She said she did not believe the pattern was wrong to demand discipline, or wrong to value coordination above individual instinct. She believed only that a doctrine built to survive contact with a dozen predictable species had never been tested against an enemy willing to learn its rules solely in order to break them, and that surviving such an enemy required something the pattern, as written, had never once needed before. The humility to admit it could still be surprised. In the end, the council reached a compromise that satisfied almost no one completely. Kesh was formally reprimanded for violating procedure, a mark that would follow his record for the rest of his career, but he was not removed from command, and the council quietly authorized a new classification of orders, allowing certain senior officers limited authority to bypass standard verification during active combat, under specific, tightly controlled conditions. It was a small crack in a wall that had stood unquestioned for longer than any Ashan alive could remember, but it was a crack, and HFY understood that cracks, once they existed, rarely closed again on their own. Word of the compromise reached human intelligence within weeks, passed along through a growing network of intercepted Ashan communications that fleet analysts had built steadily since the corridor battle. Elena Reyes read the report with a complicated mixture of relief and worry. The Ashan military was changing, slowly, unevenly, in ways that would eventually make the tactics she had built her entire strategy around less reliable. She had known this moment would come eventually. She had simply hoped for more time before it arrived. She did not get more time. 8 months after Corvin Station, the Ashan Dominion launched what human intelligence would later call the largest offensive of the entire war, a coordinated strike against 3 human systems simultaneously, spearheaded by a combined fleet of over 200 ships. Command of the operation had been given, after considerable internal debate, to Doran Kesh himself, now carrying both the scars of his earlier reprimand and the hard-won authority the Council's new rules quietly granted him. Fleet Admiral Osei understood immediately what this offensive represented. It was not simply an attack, it was a test, deliberately designed by an enemy who had studied humanity's methods as carefully as humanity had studied theirs, to determine whether the tricks that had won at the corridor and at Corvan Station could still work against a Dominion that had learned to expect them. "They know what we do now," Osei told Elena during an emergency briefing 3 weeks before the offensive was expected to strike. "Kesh has spent the better part of a year studying every recording we let slip through captured transmissions. Whatever we try, we have to assume he's already built a contingency for it." Elena had reached the same conclusion independently. Over the past 8 months, she had watched Ashan communication patterns grow steadily more resistant to the kinds of deception that had worked so reliably before. Patrols now verified suspicious signals through multiple independent channels before acting. Pattern keepers had been granted slightly more discretion to dismiss implausible orders without lengthy formal review. The Dominion had not abandoned its core doctrine, could not abandon it without abandoning the identity that held its entire civilization together, but it had learned, painfully and slowly, to build small defenses against the specific weaknesses humanity had exploited. "If the old tricks won't work," Daniel Reyes said during the same briefing, now a permanent fixture in Elena's planning sessions after Corvin Station had settled whatever doubts remained between them, "what's left?" Elena had spent weeks thinking about exactly that question, and the answer she had reached troubled her more than any tactical problem she had faced before. The Ashan military's deepest weakness had never really been its rigid procedures themselves. It had been the assumption, held by every soldier from the newest recruit to the oldest pattern keeper, that the pattern could not be wrong, that deviation from it was always dangerous, and following it was always safe. Kesh's reprimand and quiet authority had chipped away at that assumption at the very top of the Ashan command structure, but it had not reached the ordinary soldiers who still made up the overwhelming majority of every fleet. Soldiers who had spent their entire lives believing that questioning the pattern was close to the worst thing an Ashan could do. "We stopped trying to trick their sensors," Elena said finally. "We make them doubt each other instead." The plan she built over the following weeks was the most ambitious deception she had ever attempted, one that depended less on false signals and decoy ships, and more on a deep, patient understanding of exactly how Ashan military culture punished deviation from expected behavior. Rather than convincing the Dominion fleet that a threat existed which did not, she planned to convince ordinary Ashan soldiers, quietly and individually, that their own commanders might be the ones breaking procedure, forcing soldiers already trained to distrust deviation, to turn that distrust inward, against the very officers leading them into battle. It required identifying, through months of intercepted communication, individual Ashan officers within Kesh's combined fleet, who had reputations for occasionally bending procedure under pressure. Officers who, like Kesh himself, had begun to develop small habits of independent judgment since Corvin Station. Ashworth's team spent weeks building a detailed picture of exactly which officers fit this profile, then constructed a careful campaign of intercepted, altered, and fabricated communications, designed to make ordinary soldiers under those specific officers begin quietly questioning whether their commanders were following proper authorization, or simply making convenient decisions and calling them procedure after the fact. It was, Elena knew, a deeply uncomfortable kind of warfare, one that turned an enemy's own soldiers against their own trusted commanders, rather than against an obvious external threat. She raised her doubts openly with Osei, before finalizing the plan, laying out exactly what the tactic would do to ordinary Ashan crews who had never personally chosen this war. Soldiers, who would spend the coming battle doubting officers who might have done nothing wrong at all. Osei listened without interrupting, then asked Elena a single question in return. How many soldiers, human or Ashan, had already died at the Thren Corridor and Corvan Station, fighting a war neither side had fully chosen either? Elena did not have an answer that made the decision easier, only one that made it necessary. She thought carefully about whether it crossed a line she did not want to cross, manipulating loyalty and trust rather than simply outmaneuvering an enemy on the battlefield. In the end, she concluded that a war fought to protect 12,000 people at the Thren Corridor, and however many more waited in the path of a 200-ship offensive now, did not leave room for tactics she found comfortable. It only left room for tactics that worked, and she resolved to remember, later, when the war was finally over, to ask herself honestly whether this decision had been the right one. The Ashan offensive struck the human systems of Calder's Rest, Ombre Station, and the colony world of New Providence, within the same 48-hour period, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Kesh personally commanded the largest force, aimed directly at New Providence, the most heavily populated of the three targets, and the closest thing humanity had left to a symbolic answer to the loss of the Colossus, a world that had grown into a major shipbuilding center over the past decade. The battle at New Providence began exactly as Kesh had prepared for. His fleet advanced in a distributed formation, even more resilient than the one used at Corvin Station, with clear contingency procedures already drilled into every captain for handling suspicious signals, unverified communications, and unexpected sensor readings. For the first several hours, every deception Elena's team attempted was identified and correctly dismissed within minutes, exactly as she had feared. The Ashan fleet had learned. But Elena's real plan had not yet begun. 3 hours into the battle, as Kesh's fleet pressed its advantage against New Providence's defense force, a wave of quiet, carefully targeted messages began circulating among specific ships, under officers Ashworth's team had identified months earlier. The messages did not claim to be official orders. They were far subtler than that, framed as concerned questions supposedly passed between junior officers, wondering aloud whether a particular captain's recent tactical decision truly matched procedure, or whether it had simply been made under pressure and justified afterward. Each message was small, deniable, almost impossible to trace back to a single source, and each one landed on soldiers already primed by a lifetime of training to treat any deviation from the pattern, real or suspected, as deeply troubling. It spread slowly at first, then faster, quiet doubt moving between crews, the way rumors always had, human or Ashan. Officers who had grown, since Corvin Station, slightly more comfortable making independent judgment calls, found themselves suddenly second-guessed by their own subordinates, forced to justify decisions they had made confidently only hours earlier. Some officers doubled down, insisting on their authority, which only fed the perception among uncertain crews that something unusual was happening. Others, uncertain themselves now, began reverting to strict, painfully slow procedural verification for every decision, exactly the kind of hesitation Kesh's new formation had been designed to eliminate. Kesh, watching his fleet's coordination begin to fracture from causes his sensors could not clearly identify, understood almost immediately that this was not the kind of deception he had spent 8 months preparing for. There were no false signals to detect, no fake minefields to dismiss, no impersonated command messages to trace back to their source. The confusion this time was not an external trick at all. It was something growing from within his own crews, seeded by doubts that felt, to the soldiers experiencing them, entirely their own. He made contact with Elena Reyes directly, through an open channel, during a brief lull in the fighting, something no Ashan commander had ever attempted before, in the middle of an active engagement. "You have found something new," Kesh said, his translated voice carrying a controlled, careful tone that did not fully hide the strain underneath it. "I studied everything you did before. I built defenses against all of it. And still my own soldiers no longer trust their own officers." "I didn't do anything to your soldiers that your own culture hadn't already done to them first," Elena said. "I only reminded them of it at the wrong moment." There was a long pause before Kesh answered. "You believe our pattern is a weakness." "I believe absolute certainty is always a weakness," Elena said. "In anyone. Yours or ours." Kesh did not respond to that immediately. When he did, his voice carried something Elena had not expected to hear from an Ashan commander. Something close to genuine, weary curiosity, rather than anger. "If I ordered every ship in this fleet to ignore procedure entirely, right now, to fight however each captain believed best, without asking permission from anyone, what would happen?" "I don't know," Elena admitted honestly. "Neither do you." "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" The channel closed without another word. Elena never learned exactly what Kesh decided in the minutes that followed, whether he gave that order or not, whether pride, duty, or exhaustion made the choice for him in the end. What she did learn, from sensor data and later intelligence reports, was that the Ashan fleet at New Providence, roughly 4 hours into the battle, stopped behaving like a single coordinated force entirely. Some ships fought with sudden, uncharacteristic aggression, breaking formation to pursue targets independently. Others held rigidly in place, waiting for orders that, in the confusion, never clearly arrived. A few, remarkably, began fighting with a kind of improvised coordination Ashan doctrine had never described, small groups of captains, making decisions together in the moment, trusting each other more than they trusted a chain of command that no longer felt reliable. The human defense fleet at New Providence, reinforced quietly over the preceding weeks with everything Osei could spare, pressed the advantage relentlessly. By the time Kesh's fleet finally began a full retreat, nearly 7 hours after the battle began, it had lost more than 90 ships, the single heaviest defeat the Ashan Dominion had suffered in the entire war. Simultaneous, smaller victories at Calder's Rest and Ombre Station, achieved through more conventional tactics without Elena's involvement, added to a combined result that even Fleet Admiral Osei, cautious by nature after years of hard losses, allowed herself to call decisive. News of New Providence reached the Ashan homeworld within days, and the political consequences arrived almost as quickly. Highkeeper Dessa Orun, who had spent nearly 2 years resisting Ashet Vral's warnings about the pattern's vulnerabilities, could no longer defend a doctrine that had just produced the single worst defeat in Ashan military history, not against a stronger enemy, but against one that understood the Dominion's own soldiers better than the Dominion's leadership seemed to. Kesh, remarkably, was not removed from command this time. His reputation, already unusual for surviving one reprimand and returning to lead the Dominion's largest offensive, had grown into something closer to respect among younger officers, who had quietly begun studying his decisions, the way older generations studied the pattern itself. 3 months after New Providence, the Ashan Dominion opened formal communication with Human Command for the first time since the war began, not to negotiate surrender exactly, but to propose a ceasefire, while both sides considered what a lasting peace might require. Fleet Admiral Osei led the human delegation herself. Elena Reyes was asked to attend as well, an unusual request for an officer of her rank, but one that reflected how deeply her methods had reshaped the war's final chapter. She sat across a conference table from Ashan representatives for the first time in her life, and found, sitting among them, HFY Vral, the pattern keeper whose quiet, persistent investigation had done more than any single battle to open the door toward this moment. They did not speak at length that first day, but HFY Vral found a moment near the end of the session to approach Elena privately. "For a long time, I believed you were simply clever," HFY Vral said, through a translation device that rendered her careful, measured tone into plain human speech. "Now I believe you understood something about us that we did not understand about ourselves. I do not know yet whether that makes you an enemy worth fearing, or a teacher worth listening to." "Maybe it doesn't have to be only one or the other," Elena said. HFY Vral considered that for a long moment, before offering something that, on an Ashan face, might have been the beginning of a smile, or might simply have been fatigue, after a war that had cost both their peoples more than either had wanted to spend. "Perhaps not," she said. "Perhaps that too is something the pattern never accounted for." The ceasefire held. Formal peace talks began the following year, slow and difficult, built on a fragile trust between two peoples who had spent a decade trying to destroy each other, and now had to learn, carefully, how not to. Kesh himself, stripped of frontline command as part of the political settlement but not disgraced, took a quiet post training a new generation of Ashan officers, teaching a modified doctrine that HFY Vral had spent months drafting, one that kept the discipline and coordination that had always been the Dominion's strength, while finally, for the first time in Ashan history, teaching soldiers when questioning an order was not betrayal, but survival. It was not a change the oldest generation of pattern keepers ever fully accepted, but among the officers who had fought at New Providence and lived, it took root quickly, the way any lesson learned at great cost tends to. Back on Earth, people still remembered the Colossus, still visited memorials listing the names of the 4,000 crew who died at Halden Reach, still spoke sometimes of the ship that had once made them feel unstoppable, and the admiral who went down with it. Fleet Admiral Osei retired 2 years after the ceasefire, her long career ending not with the fall of a great flagship, but with the quiet, hard-won beginning of a peace nobody had believed possible during the darkest months after Cade's death. Daniel Reyes stayed in the fleet, eventually taking command of Corvin Station's permanent defense force, and made a point, every year on the anniversary of the battle, of reading aloud the names of the 17 ships lost there, refusing to let a victory built on clever deception overshadow the ordinary courage that had made it possible. But increasingly, when people spoke about the ship that had truly ended the war, they did not mean a bigger ship, or a stronger one. They meant a small, oddly built vessel, with weak guns, and a strange purpose, commanded by an officer nobody had expected much from, that had done something no amount of armor ever could. It had found the one weapon an old, proud, disciplined enemy had never learned to defend against. Not fear, not firepower, but doubt, planted carefully, at exactly the right moment, until an entire people that had never once needed to question how to fight finally, quietly, forgot.